Okay, we should go by alphabetical order.
Well, very well. My name is Allan Aquino. I am a lecturer for the Department of Asian American Studies at Cal State Northridge.
Okay, and my name is Glenn Omatsu, and I'm also a lecturer at Asian American Studies and Educational Opportunity Program at Northridge.
Okay. And how did the two of you meet?
You mind if we hear your version first? I know how.
Actually, it would be two slightly different versions, because the
Yes.
first time I met him was actually through Dr. Kenyon Chan, who at that time was the chair of Asian American Studies at Cal State Northridge. And I was not familiar at all with the Asian American Studies program up at Northridge, and I found out about it through Don Nakanishi, the director of the Asian American Studies Center, because Kenyon contacted Don and was very desperate to find somebody to teach a summer bridge class for EOP in the summer of, I think it was 1995. And
Right.
it was largely because EOP at that time, the director, Jose Luis Vargas, had just taken over as director about a year before and decided that he wanted to diversify the course offerings in EOP. Up until that time, they had a Chicano Studies section and also a Black Studies section, Pan-African Studies, and he decided there should be an Asian American Studies section. And so he got that through the administration, and then the next thing was to find an instructor. The Asian American Studies department at that time was very, very small. Had essentially the chair and part-time faculty. And so no one in the existing department wanted to teach in the bridge program for the summer. And so that's where Dr. Chan contacted Don Nakanishi and asked if there was anybody at UCLA who would like to teach, So at that particular time, I was interested because up until probably I was about 50 years old, I worked pretty much part-time basis. And so I was always on the lookout for various other kinds of part-time jobs. And the description of when Dr. Chan told me about the bridge program just fascinated me because this would be first-generation college students. I also found out there's special admit. So essentially, it was what people, activists had fought for back at the time of ethnic studies, to bring in people who are excluded from universities and have them be in the universities. And also, he told me that it was going to be the first Asian American Studies section, so I was intrigued for those reasons. But I myself was not familiar with the Northridge campus. I had no idea at all resources on the campus. And so I said if I was going to do it, I would like to then have somebody to work with me when the existing students, and I'd be willing to pay them. It wouldn't be very much, but I would be willing to pay them. And so Dr. Chan then said he had the perfect person in mind. And he's always talked very, I think Allan knows this, but he always has talked very highly of Allan. He said that of all the students he had taught up until that time, Allan was the one that he felt was the most dedicated, the most intellectual, the one that had the most commitment to Asian American studies. And so he said this would be the perfect person, And so based on Kenyon's recommendation, I said, yes, I would be willing to do that. And that's what led to the meeting with Allan.
Is that a stretch from your version of how you met?
Well, it certainly is because I really wasn't aware of the backstory, as it were, for how our first Asian American Studies sections were implemented in the EOP Bridge program. As a student, as an undergrad at the time, I had just become a junior, I think. I was aware of the EOP program because some of my friends who happened to be Filipino American were in the program. But it wasn't until then that I heard that Professor Chan told me about this new move of implementing finally an Asian American Studies section. So likewise, he recruited me, and he told me in just a very general fashion about Summer Bridge, because I was aware of EOP, but I'd never really heard of Summer Bridge. And it wasn't a program that was largely open or made aware to Asian American students. And, I certainly tell our EOP students, no, I wish I knew about Summer Bridge back then. I could have benefited from it tremendously. And prior to the spring and early summer where I had met you, and as I recall, we had a kind of informal interview, as it were, I had a little bit of experience peer mentoring for Professor Chan's intro class in the fall of '94. And when he proposed the idea, would you like some more experience with that, essentially, working hands-on with students, assisting a professor. He didn't have to ask me twice. I knew that I wanted to do that because, it's been said that sometimes it just takes one person to believe in you to make all the difference. For me, at that point in my life, it was Professor Chan. When I took my first Asian American Studies class for the first time ever, I had an inkling of what I wanted to do with my life, and better yet, for the rest of my life. And I kind of walked into it blind. I didn't know what to expect either. Mm-hmm. And I felt an immediate rapport and comfort with you. And I never knew you. Mm-hmm. I'd never met you before. Mm-hmm. I hadn't really, because I was still kind of a youngster, a rookie in the Asian American Studies game at CSUN, as it were. And that's how it started from my end. It's not as expanded and detailed a story as, as you told, because obviously you were more directly involved, but I really just kind of tagged along. And my mentor here is, had mentioned that he paid me out of his own pocket, and that was one of, it's difficult to describe my reaction to receiving a personal check from you, because I was willing to do it for free, and I would do anything, for my mentors in Asian American Studies for free. And the fact that you had done that, it was a big gesture for me and my family. I was like, I don't know. I had a debate with my aunt. I was like, I don't know if I want to take this. I don't know if I should cash this, for God's sake, because I'm looking forward to the experience. But then it occurred to me that I had no way to pay for textbooks in the fall. Mm-hmm. So I graciously accepted it, and I believe the program for us was 5 weeks during that summer of '95, mm-hmm. was one of the most important and formative learning experiences of my life. And that literally was the first time that I got hands-on experience as part of an educational environment. Mm-hmm. I guess that's the long and short of my take on it. That was 19 years ago. Well, the particular items I brought, they involve you directly, so feel I kindly ask you to chime in and give your input on your involvement with these things as well. The first thing I brought, I had 2 photographs that span 20 years. The first time that I was given an opportunity to work as a peer mentor, as the term we use now, was the fall of 1994, when Kenyon Chan recruited a bunch of us to facilitate discussion groups in his Introduction to Asian American Studies class. So not all of us are here. There are, I think, 2 or 3 more members of this cohort. And for me, that was when truly I became a devotee of Asian American Studies and our original mission, which is to bring the community to the classroom and the classroom to the community, and vice versa, and to serve as mentors and to not be divisive in how we approach the sharing of knowledge. And that 20 years later, this picture may require some explanation. This is a picture during the dedication ceremony of our Asian American Studies Activity Center. It was renamed appropriately the Glen Omatsu House. And this was our dedication ceremony. And in this particular photo, you're talking with some of our alum. There's Allan Balangay and Jennifer De Vera and Nicole Manalang. They're students who took classes with both of us at some point, and just within the span of 20 years to see how, as I said, I introduced Professor Omatsu during a distinguished guest lecture. As I said then, mentors beget mentors and scholars beget scholars. And if I had, I thought this was a great picture, because if I, in my own, way as a lecturer, had any kind of positive impact upon these particular students as you did, well, certainly much of the credit of what I might have accomplished, I give due credit to you, because the way I see it, I'm just passing along what had been given to me. I'm not the one who invented these ideals. They are archetypal and timeless, and they're much bigger than me. So, within the span of 20 years, being a person who's been on both sides of the classrooms, I can bear witness to how our community, our environment has grown and changed, for better or worse. Every time has its own set of obstacles. As a gift and a token of appreciation, this is a gift that Professor Omatsu gave me during the summer that I worked with him. I've been looking for this book for years. It was hard to get a hold of it. In addition to, compensating me out of his own pocket that summer, at the end of our summer bridge, session, summer 1995, he gave this to me as a gift, which I faithfully read and continued to use in my own classes. And meeting Philip Veracruz in person in the fall of '92, that was my first taste of an Asian American Studies event and of, an actual, living icon and figure. And if I were to crystallize my own attitude or belief regarding what we do, I always quote him first. Leadership is only incidental to the movement. Movements must go beyond their leaders. We're all part of something bigger. And during Professor Omatsu's keynote speech this past spring, when he expounded upon the ideal of militant humility, the first thing it reminded me of was that. It's not about, from my point of view, I thought that, it certainly is not about ego or pride or gain. It is about being subversive and changing things from the inside, but doing so realizing that as individuals we are part of something bigger that we must keep mind of. Not everything's going to rely on one person or one group of people. And another one of our community colleagues, Tony Osumi, our first CSUN graduate to go to the UCLA program, in a mural that he installed in Campbell Hall, he quoted you. The people, not the elites, are the makers of history. This is a reader that I use in my Asian American Studies classes, the most recent reader, and as part of the assigned reading, I included your speech from the spring. I forwarded you a PDF copy, actually. And this particular reader, I have a habit of not throwing things away. When I find something that's useful and timeless, I use it. So a lot of the readings I use are readings that I was assigned as an undergraduate. They still have value and merit to this day, and I think they should be passed on. So I incorporate them. It's through Asian American Studies that I was able to meet many of my other mentors, like Professor Emily Lawson and the Cordova family, that my involvement with FONS. And the important thing, we were talking about this earlier about, Asian American pan-ethnicity, if you will. That's a notion that Professor Kadian Chen really was an ardent supporter of, an Asian American pan-ethnicity. I definitely believe in that. I believe that we should give due focus on our individual communities, but not be limited to that, not be dogmatic about that, because our mutual support for one another as one community, not just as APIs, as Angelinos, I like to think, is something that needs to be continued and propagated. And one of the last final object that I brought today, one of the biggest honors I've had as, I guess, a scholar was being incorporated in a book project that Glenn was co-editor of, a book focused on pedagogy and practical teaching tactics. And I was asked to write a couple of pieces pertaining to Filipino American experience classes, but just knowing that I would be given an opportunity to share my experiences and my knowledge alongside people whom I regard as mentors and heroes was a great thing. And when I look back at the past 20, 22 years, it's still hard to believe that so much can happen. But yeah, well, those are the objects I brought today.
Glenn, what are your thoughts from all of this?
Well, I would say one thing is a little bit different because, I don't know if you know that much about Allan's history, But his history is actually very important when you think in terms of like more development of, I guess you could say, trends of Asian Americans, up to now and probably in the future. When I started teaching at CSUN, I realized that he's a storehouse of knowledge because he lives in the San Fernando Valley and has seen the transition of the development of Asian American communities up there. And so there are a number of communities that are probably studied a lot, and then other communities that are not studied at all, right? So one community that's not studied at all is Panorama City, and Panorama City became really interesting to me when I started teaching up at CSUN because, what I noticed in the census figures that, it was a city that had nearly majority Asian American, mostly Filipino American. Right? So like when we talk in terms of evolution of communities, right? We talk about ethnoburbs, creation of new kinds of like communities. Some get studied over in San Gabriel Valley, but they don't get studied up in San Fernando Valley. Right. And what I noticed with Filipino community was kind of like then a precursor because then what I saw was Korean community started growing the same way. Right. And then Filipinos kind of spread out from Panorama City, mostly to the West Valley. Right. So then this man became living history. Right. He literally, like you were in the valley before there's a lot of Filipinos. Mm-hmm. Then you started to see the influx of Filipinos. You started to then see a community like Panorama City literally change from, not having any kind of Filipino presence to become, essentially Filipino dominant presence, right? You saw different institutions, St. Genevieve and other places, also become essentially Asian American institutions. Right, so this is why I said that these are kinds of like things that a lot of times they get missed on scholarly works on Asian American studies. So that's why it's a good thing we have somebody like Allan, who actually lives it and is able to teach the classes, but also put it in a larger kind of context. The other thing is that and the two of you would know this as well. When we look at evolution of Asian American studies, unfortunately, some institutions get foregrounded, right? San Francisco State, Berkeley, certainly UCLA, okay? But there's other programs that, unless you went there and you're connected with it, you don't know the history behind it, right? Mm-hmm. And so Fullerton is that way, USC is that way, and certainly Northridge is that way, right? But what we find in all the different kinds of campus is that, there's a certain similar, what we could call Asian American student experience, right? And certain similar kinds of issues that people face. What's interesting to me about Northridge is that, Northridge, unlike say places like UCLA or even something like USC, Asian Americans are still a minority or regarded as a minority on campus, and what's going to be interesting, I think, in the future is that Latinos are now becoming the majority on campus. So I think it's really important on the CSUN campus of alliance between Asians and Latinos if an Asian American voice is to be heard. I think it's the same with African Americans because African Americans at CSUN campus are still relatively small, bigger than UCLA, bigger probably than USC, but still relatively small, right? So therefore, then Latinos become kind of like, more the dominant voice. And I think that, with the evolution of Metro over the years, Metro does have more of an understanding of more multi-ethnic kinds of consciousness, but it's also up to the Asian Americans as well as African Americans to also be part of that dialogue, to make sure then, their voices are heard, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess you could say the flip side of that, when you look at other kinds of campuses, and this where we come into Berkeley, UCLA, UC Irvine, et cetera, where there's more Asian American presence, then the flip side is that Asian American students, where they're the majority, also have a responsibility to advocate for all the other, underrepresented groups as well. Right? Sometimes that gets forgotten, right? Because again, people think in terms of their own empowerment, but not necessarily the empowerment attached to other people, right? So that's where I think that especially student activists probably, if they're a majority Asian American campus where there's empowerment, need to reach out to other campuses just to learn about, different strategies that students have, in terms of getting their voices heard.
I'm searching my phone for this quote of yours that I have from your article from Four Prisons.
Oh.
So a lot of us were reading that avidly, and I always think about this quote to this day, especially, well, I'd like to just read it and then I'd like to get a response from you guys. Ask ourselves a series of questions. Will we fight only for ourselves, or will we embrace the concerns of all oppressed peoples? Will we overcome our own oppression and help to create a new society, or will we become a new exploiter group in the present American hierarchy of inequality? Will we define our goal of empowerment solely in terms of individual advancement for a few, or as the collective liberation of all peoples?
Well, I remember when I was a student in Asian American Studies, there was an exercise we would do, which I incorporate in my classes today, where we begin by breaking down what do we mean by Asian American. And I recall the exercise that we used in your 345 class, where we would respond to the whole "what are you" question. And typically students would reply by declaring their ethnic identity. And for the API students, they'd say, yeah, Chinese, Korean, so on and so forth. Nobody would say Asian American. Very few would. And why is that, you know? And my personal take, and I'm not alone in this regard, I don't mean to make this Allan-centric, is if you were to ask me, hey, what are you? I would probably by instinct respond with my ethnic community, oh, I'm Filipino, whatever. But if you were to, I wouldn't say Asian American instinctively, but if you were to ask me, but are you Asian American? Do you consider yourself Asian American? Without hesitation, I would say yes. And that's because despite our superficial differences in terms of our cultural origins and the histories of our largely immigrant backgrounds, we nonetheless share deeper common social and historical experiences here in America. And the experiences that we share with one another, they're experiences that our ancestors and peoples in Asia will never know. Now, coming from an immigrant, mostly immigrant community as I do, as a Filipino American, the fact that I'm here with you three, okay, it's an experience. I love that word. It's an experience that can only truly happen here, where, never mind the differences in our histories and cultures as per our Asian ancestral roots. It's only here where we find a sense of community. And my summary of Asian history is this. We would also break down all the different ethnic communities, mostly immigrant communities within Asian American communities. And my take on Asian American history, you see all these people here, South Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander. Here's Asian history. It's hundreds of years of these people trying to kill each other. But here, and only here, can we find an opportunity for us to find a sense of community. And in my experience in Asian American studies, one of the great blessings and virtues is the longer I've been involved, the more I feel a sense of an ecumenical outlook on our communities, increasingly less divisive and more in terms of what we share as I say now, Los Angelinos. If you were to ask me, hey, what are you? I'd probably say that. I'm a Los Angelino. The culture and daily life that I have here is something that can only exist here, that only I can have. And although I am still very deeply proud of my Philippine heritage and I still have ties to family in the Philippines, my people in the Philippines, they don't know what it's like. I have a life here that only we can understand, and it makes it natural and effortless, I think, to find a sense of empathy and respect for other communities who are dealing with the same struggles for social justice that all of us ultimately have to deal with. I think for me, that's probably been the greatest reward that I've gotten from Asian American studies, and that's why, although a lot of people have reservations about taking an Asian American studies class, because we have a lot of non-API students on occasion, the first thing I'll tell them is, this is not an ethnic club. This class is a GE class. It's open to everybody to learn something new, and we're not here to think divisively. That's been my take on it.
What do you do with a degree in Asian American Studies, right? And then there are more questions about how to get involved in communities and why it's important, more understanding, more, why there are different kinds of community organizations, what you can do in communities, especially within immigrant communities, if a person doesn't speak the native language, can they still be useful, right? So these kinds of questions, right? Then there's a whole kinds of questions regarding activism, so I guess those go beyond Asian American Studies, but just generally activism, right? Those get into things like sustainability, like burnout, more dealing with internal conflicts, dealing with people who kind of like disappoint you, by doing things that are against like community norms and things like that. There's also questions about like what community empowerment means, right? The interesting one in community empowerment, like we can talk about critiquing individual advancement, right? But we also can look about, whether or not, like, if Asian Americans achieve some amount of power, is that then collective empowerment, And see, back when I wrote that particular quote, that was early 1990s. And so the situation now is what you find something that probably most people, I don't think, would have felt would have been possible back in early 1990s. There's one now state in the United States, majority Asian American. Right, one of the biggest, most celebrated cities, San Francisco, is majority Asian American. Right, so then that raises a question: once people become majority and have capability, obviously gets into voting and other kinds of like things like that. But once you become majority, you have the possibility then of pretty much setting direction on different things. Right, and I think there's a lot of like good critiques coming out by Asian American activists about some of like the challenges and then also how they're grappling with the same question. One person I know, Eric Marr, who I'm not sure if he's still on the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, but he, like me, comes from a background of Asian American movement, political activism. He, like Warren, got involved in electoral politics, almost like Warren ran for school board in San Francisco and eventually Board of Supervisors. So I haven't had to talk with him, but I'm sure that the question about, then how then do you use Asian American political empowerment to also address other kinds of like issues, and especially when we grew up in an era where it was always fashionable to critique whites in power. Right. Once we get into a position, what do we do? Right. So that's one of the questions. I think that's kind of like an important one. Hawaii is actually an interesting example, right? Because you would have like a situation where Japanese Americans, especially, pretty much at one time dominated electoral offices within Hawaii, and we could say that the situation of Native Hawaiians didn't necessarily improve, right? Also, what we see is their own racial hierarchy within Hawaii regarding Filipinos, Portuguese, et cetera, et cetera. So that means that, Asian Americans aren't immune from also continuing racism or continuing the structure of oppression that also exists, right? The good thing is that, there are scholars and there are also like activists who I think are more conscious of these questions and, have tried to like set the dialogue regarding this, And so I think that's the thing that as we think about the future, for Asian Americans, we need to probably look at in different kinds of like ways. So I guess going back to your question, a lot of times, the questions I'm asked, I also try to put in questions that aren't asked because those are the things that probably people have to start thinking about more. Right. The other thing I'll add, because I don't usually have a chance to talk about this, but one of my other mentors is a man named K.W. Lee. So K.W. Lee, is pretty well known within Korean community, and then outside of Korean community, I think he's more known among people who are journalism. Because K.W. Came over to the United States as immigrant from Korea, 1950s. Went to journalism school, and then his first job placement was in the South. So this is before civil rights movement, right? You could imagine a Korean immigrant, and then coming into like the United States, and first thing that he sees is racial segregation, right? And KW has always been a fascinating kind of like person because he's made it within mainstream media. He's on what's called the 100 journalists in the Hall of Fame. Okay, so I think he's probably one of the only Asian Americans in there, So he's made it within mainstream media. He has a reputation of being a strong investigative journalist, But, KW also then has made it a point of not compromising his principles. Okay, so KW criticizes what he calls a white man. He's a fascinating person to talk to because it's kind of like a person who came to the United States growing up in the black community. He basically talks like an older black person. right? And so that's where Korean youth are always really surprised because they're expecting this elderly, Korean, he spouts out, all kinds of like words, right? But because he gets people's attention, then he's able to put forward major kinds of like points. So the one point that I want to share, because it's kind of like an interesting one, is his analysis in the Asian American community. He speaks especially of Koreans, but this would be generally for Asian American communities, what he calls the new Mandarin. Okay, so he's been talking about this and writing about it for about the last 15 years. And the new Mandarin would be the following. He would say that, immigrants come and they work hard, but what ends up happening is that the immigrants, are not able to really achieve the kind of success that they have. So they put a lot of emphasis on the education of their children, In Korean community, the focus is to get the kids into the best colleges possible and, prepare them for different kinds like professions and careers in those areas. And so KW says that unfortunately what's happened, he sees in the Korean community, but I think that his analysis would be for other Asian American communities, is that what this leads to is more assimilation into more all the norms of American society and all the negative things, individualism, right? Not caring about other kinds of people, starting to think more like the oppressor rather than, the oppressed. So KW says that, this he thinks is a very, very serious problem because what he sees then is the evolution of a grouping of people who become then leaders within society, right? These are the people that, become lawyers. These are people who become doctors. These are the people that, sit on different kinds of committees, policy boards, and things like that. And that he said that there's no consciousness about the experience of their own parents or other people within the community. And so KW says that he doesn't really know what to do about this other than write about it, and in his own colorful way, I remember a conversation I had with him about 5 years ago, and he said that he's never ever going to write a letter of recommendation for a Korean American going to law school ever again, right? Okay, and a lot of students approached him because he's taught for a few years at UCLA, through Asian American studies. His classes became very popular. He speaks quite a bit. So people approach him. And the number one thing they usually say is, "I want to be a lawyer. I want you to write a letter of recommendation." And then he said, of all the letters of recommendation, he said there's only one person, and he emphasized only one person, who went into civil rights law, even though all the other people said they were going to do it, only one person did it. So therefore, I'm not going to write any more letters of recommendation, right? But that one person is actually a special person. That's Do Kim. Okay, so so it's kind of like where KW basically says that even though the emergence of what do you call the new Mandarins, actually there's also the counter thing, right? And that's the counter thing that we have to continue to emphasize, right? And Do Kim, I don't know if you've ever talked to him, but he was very highly influenced by KW. He went into civil rights law, but he basically does multicultural law work. One of his specialties is on police abuse kinds of cases. So he works with a number of different other progressive attorneys, but he's also focused in terms of working in the Korean community through the KW Leadership Institute, right? And I had a chance. I normally don't have a chance to go to a lot of community events, but I had a chance to go to the last KW Leadership Awards ceremony, and it was interesting because, they make it a point of essentially not honoring only Korean Americans, but also multicultural, right? And so the group that they picked out honoring, actually you might know her, Maisie Chin, works with her, right? But they picked that group out, and, Maisie, when she got up, gave it a very, essentially the mirror image of what KW would say, She, as a Chinese American woman, a lot of times is seen as a person with privilege, and she says that therefore she has a responsibility to work with the parents and work with other people to show that Asian Americans are as committed to social justice as everybody else. Right? So I just wanted to raise this particular point because, as we think in terms of the future, of Asian Americans activists play probably a pivotal kind of role, right? But Asian American activists will probably also see that there's going to be increasing numbers of other Asian Americans within mainstream who have an entirely different understanding what Asian American empowerment means, right? And so then being able to speak out on that, but, at the same time, do it in such a way of educational rather than cutting people off and, telling people to sell us or something like that is going to be really critical, because as Asian Americans continue to gain more kinds like power, right, then it's going to be critical for that grouping of people to also understand how to use the power responsibly.
See how for any students of Asian American Studies, I guess this has been kind of it's been a kind of melancholy experience for me, I suppose, seeing how for generations of students now, being that have been around long enough, the sense of idealism and commitment to social justice, particularly for young college students at that phase of their life, for many of them, it's exactly that. It's kind of a phase. And after they graduate and settle in their careers and everyday lives and segue into what we might call the middle class, whatever that is, their sense of idealism that was so ardent and passionate during their tenure in college, it tends to kind of fade away, and their priorities focus more on everyday things, which is fine. I'm not criticizing them. This is just an observation, but for me, it's a little bit melancholy. Of course, they're entitled to pursue the careers that they want, to rage against the mono-minority construct and find their passion and to build a livelihood and to start families. Of course, they're entitled to that. They're entitled to find their joy, but I guess the kind of melancholy thing is that for a lot of students, many of them, who are lifelong close friends, I see that, or I sense that sense of idealism that we had back in the day kind of fading away or taking a back seat. And I quietly wonder, do you even care anymore? Because when an issue that comes up that hits our communities especially hard, I keep them in the loop. I tell them about events. I tell them about, resources that they might want to mention or get their families involved. And they, for whatever reason, which I respect, will play it safe and stay within their comfort zone. But I think of families who've been in the community for so long, like, Enrique and Proce, the De La Cruz family, or Florante and Rose Ibanez, and how they managed to find their joy and settle in their family, and they're still committed. And my perceptions of the larger picture have their limitations, but, when I think of like the De La Cruz and the Ibanez family just as two examples, I'd be like, how come we can't have more folks like you? And I asked Florante about that one time. It's, less than a year ago, I was at an event with Florante, and I asked him, what kept you going? What kept you going and not succumb to just, retreating into silence and settling in your comfort zone and just raising your kids quietly and turning, I dare say, a blind eye to pressing issues of social justice in our community? And his immediate response at the time was, well, it's not for everybody. Meaning that maintaining the sense of idealism and passion, for reasons that I am not qualified to explain, it's just some people aren't built for it. And that has been kind of a melancholy thing to see people who I think, perhaps I'm being chauvinistic and dogmatic in my point of view, I admit that, seeing people who at one point seem like, oh my goodness, they could change the world with their visions and their passions, kind of just, gently settle in their comfort zone. I'm not in a position to judge. I don't love them any less, but it is kind of a sad thing to have my hopes kind of let down like that. But, and I suppose here's where the hopeful angle comes in. That doesn't mean that there are people who are going to give up the fight, as it were. There are always going to be people, even if they are minorities within minorities, loosely speaking, who are going to keep that idealism burning. And at the end of most semesters these days, when I have my final words to students, all I can really say to them is the sense of optimism and hope and passion for justice that you feel right now. You don't have to give that up. In my opinion, you don't really grow old, as it were, until you make the decision to put away your toys, to put away idealism and conform to what you think is supposed to be a righteous life. If you feel something, during our time in this class that makes complete sense to you, that makes you actually believe with all your heart that there are possibilities of a better world for all people, you don't have to give that up. And I hope that you choose never to give that up. I think the challenge of Asian American Studies is finding new creative strategies to pass along that virtue and to keep it alive. And we do make the effort to keep in touch with our alumni and with the veterans of our classes, not just for the sake of camaraderie and the friendship that we formed over the years, but to, keep in touch with them and in whatever way help them stay the course. No matter what life you choose, I hope you don't lay aside these virtues. And regarding the question of what to do with an Asian American Studies major, I always begin with the counter question. Well, in a perfect world, what do you want to do? Mm-hmm. Period. Do you want to be a doctor or a lawyer, or a scientist? That's fine, or do you want to be an artist, or do you want to be this? No, figure out, what do you want to do first? Whatever that is, we're going to give you some enormous tools that can help you really change the game from the inside and to connect you with a community that is going to bring you so much joy. So first and foremost, figure out what you want to do with your life, young one. And whatever that may be, okay, we can give you an amazing wellspring of tools that you can take with you to make your life and to make that discipline even better. Yeah. I mean, I haven't given up. I refuse to, but it is sad for me to think that maybe it's just a phase of idealism for some people, but that's not a reason to give up hope, because at the same time I believe that it is continued, even if only at the hands of a few people. But then again, when I think about the history of every social movement, it usually begins with a small population of idealists, like a pebble in a pond. It just takes that one right influence. And we got a lot of work to do, but when I think of the past couple of decades from my limited experience, we have evolved in a lot of ways at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I could add is that I think the starting, I'll just say that, for those of us that have the privilege of working in academia, so Asian American Studies is part of academia, actually it is a privilege because, we get to basically think for a living, right? We get to teach students for a living, right? We get to read books, for a living, we get to have interesting discussions, for a living, right? So, unfortunately, other people don't have that kind of privilege. So I always start off by saying that anybody within academia, we do have, a responsibility to use our privileges and, help other people to also, use resources in the university. So that either means bringing Asian American Studies out into the community or sharing resources that we have on the campus with people in the community or redirecting some resources that the university doesn't want to redirect into the community, right? So I think fundamentally that's a certain responsibility all of us have in academia, right? Asian American Studies or ethnic studies in particular, I think then has another kind of responsibility, and that's what I would call responsibility to understand what it means to live within the dialectic of, essentially being in a place we're part of the university, but the university never wanted us in the first place. Okay? Right. So then, once we start thinking of that, then there are basically two ways that we could respond. We could try to fit in, which means that, we tone down, our language, what we want to do and things like that. But that ultimately is suicide, right? Because then what ends up happening is we no longer have Asian American Studies or ethnic studies, right? Okay? So that's not a good course, although sometimes because of the daily pressures, that's the course that people start to do, right? Or the other course is then, to understand we're not really wanted there, and if the university wants to, they're going to try to kick us out. But that means kind of asserting what we do believe in and trying to spread our kinds of teachings throughout the university and the rest of the place, right? So I've always felt we should go to second route. It's a harder thing, but if we do that, we have a possibility of changing the rest of the university. We also have a chance of serving the communities in different kinds of ways. Okay. Now saying that, it is hard, and I'll mention just one thing which usually doesn't come up in discussions of higher education, and that's the whole admissions stuff. Okay, admission stuff, especially with Asian Americans. So if we look at like, how admissions is usually, put forward, right? The concern right now, the debate is more on affirmative action, right? Whether it harms or, benefits Asian Americans. Okay, but actually there's a larger question that's kind of like missed in this. And this is like what I would say, and this happened over about the last 20 to 30 years, essentially like taking away the right of higher education for most people. Okay, so that's where, I think, again, as activists for people in Asian American studies, it's our duty to kind of like re-raise that question. Okay, now it's interesting because, like most of the work that I do right now is with special admit students over at Cal State Northridge, through EOP. Most of the students I actually teach now are not Asian Americans. Okay, out of the 50 freshmen that I have right now in my 2 writing classes, I have only 2 Asian Americans. Okay, in my third semester race and critical thinking class, out of 34 students, I have 1 Asian American. Okay, so who are the rest of the students? Most are Black, most are Latino, right? Okay. Now, the interesting thing is my classes are titled Asian American Studies. If probably somebody walked in the room, looked at the reading materials, curriculum kinds of like things, they say there's no Asian American content. And that's true. There's no Asian American content, but the methodology and the way that I teach is actually Asian American Studies. Right? So the students are actually getting Asian American studies, but not necessarily in terms of content. And I learned this because, students would take, Professor Aquino's class or other classes. So I don't want them to, take my class and then feel that, they're just getting duplicated stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So I teach them, more of the methodology and more the kind of like approach, okay? But I mentioned this because, see, one of the things that, is a question within EOP is how come EOP isn't doing a better job of recruiting low-income first-generation Asian American students, right? And it's an ongoing kind of like question because, see, most of the recruiters are not Asian American. They'll come and meet with me periodically. I'll basically, tell them what to do. They might do it for 1 year, but then they don't do it after that, right? They're good at recruiting, especially Latinos, because most of the recruiters are Latinos. They have a hard time with African American. Again, for the same kind of like reason, right? So then what's starting to happen is that low-income Asian American students, especially who fit in the special admit category, aren't going to college. Right? This is a major kind of like problem, right? Because it's kind of like there's no advocacy, even in community groups on that grouping of people, right? Since the debate is more on affirmative action, that grouping of people gets kind of like left out, okay? But the larger kind of like issue is, I would say, destruction of the whole right of education for all people, and I'll just use Cal State as an example because, Cal State admissions would be if you're in the top 1/3 of your high school graduating class, then you're eligible to get into one Cal State campus, right? Okay, but what I look at is what happens with the 2/3 of other students. If you're not in the 1/3 and you want to go to college, where do you go, right? So the answer usually is community college. Okay, now I taught at community college long enough, and I was also a community college student, so I know what happens to students in community college. If you look at the figures, especially on Latinos or African Americans, a lot of them start community college, they never finish. Right? Okay. So that's one of the reasons why, like in EOP, we, say that, we need to get the student into the 4-year institution because getting them to transfer, it's not going to happen. Right? They're going to get, stopped out someplace along the line. So the transfer strategy is not going to work for us. Okay. So when I raise this thing about, right of higher education, this is a question I think that we in Asian American studies have to re-inject into the whole dialogue, because otherwise what's going to happen is it's not going to be talked about, and see, like the student concerns actually, student movement actually has been very, very good on, raising this question because why? Rising fees. Right? That's part of the whole kind of like thing, right? They're paying more for their education, therefore education becomes expensive. It's harder for people to continue their education, and that's connected with the whole thing on limiting higher education, right? But, the last thing I'll say is that I feel kind of like fortunate. I ended up by accident almost, getting to know my colleague over here, Professor Aquino at Northridge, having a chance to work with him in my summer bridge class. But for the last 20 years, I actually have started to realize, this is actually, the classes I teach are actually pretty important for me to stay grounded in the community, As I've gotten older, I haven't been able to go to as many community events, right? And so then what happens happens, what grounds me is actually the students I teach. They're first generation, right? If they're Latino, their parents are probably manual workers. Some of them are farm workers. Some of them are, working within, various kinds of like sweatshops. This is a group, when I was involved in community organizing, these are people I've been working with, right? These are also students that have multitudes of different kinds of like family issues and personal issues, all associated with poverty. So these go all the way from like mental illness, severe kinds of mental illness, schizophrenia within their families, drug abuse, teen pregnancy, ongoing domestic violence, and things like this. So essentially all the different kinds of like things that we would see within communities, I have within my own classroom, and it's the students that I work with. So that's why I said I feel fortunate, because I'm able to stay grounded just because of like the realities of my students, and I have them write about this. Like since I teach writing, I thought that the best way that I could help them is have them begin to reflect on their kinds of like experiences. When they do their research paper, the research papers are actually pick out a problem and find out more about what different researchers say about doing about the problem, right? But they're able to compare their own life experiences with researchers, and sometimes they're able to critique what the researcher says on gang intervention is absolutely wrong, right? This is what they tried to do with me and it didn't work, right? So they're able to actually come up with other kinds of like suggestions. But this is why I think the admissions question is really important within higher education, because excluding this group, because essentially if I look all up and down the state of California, unfortunately, CISA and EOP is one of the few institutions now within higher education, even in the Cal State system, that has special admit students, right? UC no longer does, right? They use them for athletes or alumni that donate a lot of money, right? Then I realized that I'm really teaching kind of like almost golden kids, right? These are kids that you don't find in any other kind of like institution, right? But if other faculty had this chance, if we had our Asian American Studies students into classrooms like this, the entire dialogue would start to change, and it would become kind of like an easier thing about raising questions that about like why we need to use Asian American Studies more to provide resources for the community, right? So that's what I hope would happen in the future, that more people would understand the need to sort of begin to take on strategically right of higher education, especially for all the students right now that are shut out of education.
If you've thought about that, or
Okay, well, it's 10 to 20 years. I probably won't be around, right? That's probably what I should say, right? But the interesting kind of thing is that when I think about it, then I think what people have to do is not stay limited to what they see right now, right? So don't work on the framework in terms of lack of funding for higher education or lack of resources out in the community and things like that, or all the different kinds of educational problems. It's essentially starting more with what you'd like to see, and then starting to think about then how those things could be achieved, right? So I would hope within 10 to 20 years, what would happen is that people have reinvigorated the whole debate on higher education. So as a result, higher education both becomes affordable, but also open to everybody now that's shut out, right? But at the same time, I would hope that there's also experiments with more community-based higher education forms, right? I know my colleague, Professor Rudy Aquino, he said that, with the cost of education being the way it is, why can't, some professors just get together and form their own university and make it community-based, right? And we could get it accredited, and we could start granting degrees, right? And so I don't know if people have to go exactly to an accredited institution, but I think that we should experiment with more community-based forms of higher education, just so that people who now normally would not have a chance to take Asian American Studies or any interesting kinds of classes, creative writing or anything, have a chance to do so and have a chance to have more multi-generational kind of dialogue. Right, so I think that's if we start thinking strategically, those are the ways that then we could start to begin to change the whole system of higher education, both within higher education but also within our communities, right? And I think the interesting thing is I think that within 10 or 20 years it won't be a resource problem. I think at least when we talk about human resources, I think we'll have the capability within ourselves to do these things, right? Maybe not the money, but we'll have the capability. So that's why I think that what we have to do is we have to start with what we like to see rather than, be limited with what we see right now.
So you think it won't be a resource problem?
No, I
10 to
don't think
20
so.
years?
I don't think so.
Because of the potential of our capacity just in terms of our people's
Well,
resources.
see, all the time there's going to be a resource problem, and I think,
Yeah.
unfortunately, the people in power get us to think that certain kinds of things can't be solved unless we have the resources, right? So then once you think in that way, then it becomes kind of like a shell game, right? We have to transfer things away from here in order to do this over here, right? And if we don't have the resources, we have to wait, 5 years until we have the resources, right? Okay, but in reality, if we start to think about, something that could be done, then we think about ways of doing it. So I think the, example would be Grace Lee Boggs when she talks about revitalization of Detroit, right? You could look at urban agriculture, right? Like nobody said, we have to wait, 10 years until we have all the necessary equipment and, everything else. And then we could do, different kinds like urban agriculture. People just started to do it in their own lots and things like that, right? Okay. And then what happens is once somebody sees it as possible, they start doing it on their own too, right? Okay. So that's where, if we think in that way, right, it's not a resource question, it's more our ability to actually do it with, what we have right now, right?
Yeah. I think that's
Great
always,
to hear.
I think that's always been one of our greatest strengths. If you look at our shared collective history, even before the Third World Strike at the foundation of the ethnic studies movement, whether we're working in a campus environment or at the community at large, is our ability to operate outside of systems. To come up with our own resources and tactics. And I hope this isn't too strange, but I can't help but recall one of my favorite quotes from my colleague's speech from earlier this spring, where he said, and I quote, "I do not want today's students to believe that they need to use the same tactics that our generation did. Students today need to think creatively and imaginatively to develop new tactics and draw from the experiences of grassroots struggles now occurring in our communities." If you were to ask me literally 20 years ago, what do I imagine in 20 years, I wouldn't know how to answer it because all I can see is what's happening right now. But if I were to tell myself 20 years ago, this is going to happen and this is going to happen, I think I would be, if I were, from an optimistic point, I think I would be delightfully surprised. I don't know what's going to happen 10 or 20 years from now either. I don't know where I'm going to be, but at the very least, I hope that, again, to quote Manong Philip Veracruz, that however it permutates, the next generation, the next phase of our lives, the next phase of our communities, we continue the movement in our own ways, focusing on what's in front of us. Our wisdom is not in how many facts we know or how well traveled we are. I think our wisdom lies in how well we understand and recognize what's right there in front of us here and now. And if we could have a consciousness of that and act on that now, then whatever happens 10 or 20 years, I don't know, but there should be more reasons to be hopeful 20 years from now. I don't know what's going to happen, but I sure hope I get to be around to, be delightfully surprised. We'll see. We'll see.